I want to welcome you all to all of our favorite friends, our most generous and faithful supporters of the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. My name is Karen Clark, and I am the chair of the foundation. I want to give you just a bit of background, which I think a lot of you know, but maybe not everyone. The foundation has been around for about 30 years, was formed to raise money to provide to the library special amenities that the city budget just couldn't pay for. So we funded things like the Media Lab, a lot of the computers and the database subscriptions, just the things that are more special than just the books, not that the books aren't super special. Plus, we provide a plethora of fabulous programs and lectures, many free to the public. And these enhancements to the library and the programs would simply not exist without your support for the foundation. So this year, 2020, in all of its weirdity, has created some new challenges for us in the way that we can honor our most generous donors. This small series that we have called Local Luminaries is designed for you, our committed supporters, as a small thank you. So tonight is the first in a series of 3 talks. Unfortunately, we inadvertently scheduled our final 2 lectures for the same night as the presidential debates. Now, that's an interesting situation because it's surprising, though, for 2020, not really. We may not have any more presidential debates. So if the presidential debates do go forward as scheduled, then you will hear from us, as we will really have to change the date. You know, we just can't compete with that. You learn a lot more at our programs, but probably you will not be as, I don't know if entertained is the right word, but your blood pressure will not go as high. So we're so grateful to our 3 speakers, all outstanding UCI professors, internationally acclaimed researchers and teachers whose talks will cover the areas of race, our upcoming elections, and concerns about our judicial system. All very relevant topics for now. So I have a couple of housekeeping things. Be sure to ask questions. If you go to the bottom of your screen, those of you who aren't real familiar with Zoom, there's a little, you might have to move your mouse around to get it, but there's a thing that says Q&A, and if you hit that, you can put in questions. And at the end of the talk, we'll go to the questions and answer, and Michele will answer as many as she can. So let's proceed. I'm so proud to introduce UCI Law Professor Michele Goodwin. Today, I will be the interviewer for her. So I have a second hat. There's actually a couple of reasons for this. First, I'm the chair of the Library Foundation and an attorney. But more important, I'm a friend of Michele's, which is a good thing. So Michele is a true superstar, international speaker, prolific researcher, author of many academic publications, and also many publications that are intended for lay people like us. Her fields of expertise include bioethics, constitutional law, family law, health law, and reproductive rights. Michele sits on the national board of the ACLU, and locally she sits on the board of our local Planned Parenthood affiliate. She's received a plethora of awards for her research, writing, and teaching. And she currently hosts a very interesting and informative podcast for Ms. Magazine called On the Issues. And I recommend you give it a listen. So in addition to being the UCI Chancellor's Professor of Law, she is the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy and holds positions in the Stem Cell Research Center, in the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, in the program in public health and in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. She's been featured in among others, Forbes Magazine, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, NPR, and many others. Her most recently published book is called Policing the Womb, which is a chilling study of how some US states are going far beyond merely trying to stop abortions and are now seeking to criminalize all aspects of reproduction, including pregnancy, abortion, childbirth, and motherhood itself. I highly recommend this book, and I recommend it so highly that I would like to, I'm offering to get each and every one of you generous donors a copy. Here's the book, Michele Goodwin, Policing, two hands for this, Policing the Womb. So if you can let the foundation know that you would like a copy of this book, I will make sure to get Michele to sign it for you if you would like, and I will make sure that it gets delivered to your home. It's just another additional thanks for your support of the Library Foundation. So I've talked enough. It's time to introduce Michele Goodwin. Hello, Michele, and thanks for being here.
Karen, it is always a pleasure to be with you and to be in our community. So thank you all who've tuned in. I love Orange County. I love you all. So thank you, Karen.
Okay, well, let's get started. This talk is about the 13th Amendment. Let's see, the title is The 13th Amendment and How It Perpetuates Mass Incarceration and the Prison Labor System. Yes. So I'm going to start by just reading the 13th Amendment, which I know we all learned about in high school, but we might have forgotten. What it says is, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So you think, well, that's good, freed the slaves. You know, that was the amendment that for the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the Confederate States. So now all the slaves are free. But there's this loophole, which is referred to as the punishment clause. Involuntary servitude is okay if you're a criminal. And I know Michele has found through her research that this clause is one of the things that has helped lead to today's mass incarceration of Black people. So Michele, can you talk about the genesis of the punishment clause and whether Congress and President Lincoln understood at the time how it might be used?
So they didn't. So when the 13th Amendment was being ratified, it's important to understand that as legislation is proposed for constitutional amendment, it must be ratified. So you must have a supermajority, in effect, of states that sign on. This process can take a while. This is something that senators know. So let me back up just a little bit. So at the time of the Civil War, just before it begins, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation provided that persons who were enslaved in those Confederate states or non-Confederate states, because there were non-Confederate states that had slaves, but that all of those slaves could be freed if those states did not go along with the Union. There were actually a couple of Confederate states that said, we'll go along with the Union, so they never had to risk losing their slaves at all, which is another little feature of this that's missed. But here's what happened with the 13th Amendment. The war was fought, the Union won. And there were radical Republicans in Congress that said we must, in fact, put a very definite end to slavery in the United States. And ergo the 13th Amendment. There were slave-holding senators still in the Senate who felt the need to make sure that there would be this compromised language in the 13th Amendment. And very likely the people who had been abolitionists or those who had maybe not been abolitionists but thought that this was really important to just finally end slavery, probably could not have predicted what I'll tell you next, which is that the Southerners who advocated for this went back to their home states and they filled their law books with all manner of laws that would directly target Black people and then also mulattoes. The reason why they targeted Black people and mulattoes as well is they wanted to make it very, very clear, just like during the time of slavery, you were enslaved according to your mother's status. After slavery, you would be subjected to the same kinds of conditions. And so with this, the 13th Amendment became ratified. The Southerners signed on to the abolition of slavery with this caveat.
So what you're saying is that then there were a whole lot of laws passed that would make the newly freed slaves criminals. And can you kind of give us an example of what kinds of laws were passed?
Oh, absolutely. So these new laws, they made practically just breathing, if you were a Black person, something that could be criminal. So if there were 2 or more Black persons standing on a corner, if there were Black people who were in town more than 5 days, if your house was searched by not law enforcement, but by random white people who found that your living conditions were not up to snuff, could be something that could lead to a criminal fine. If you sold your own corn, your own wheat, the things you grew, that could also be a crime. If you were a Black person or a mulatto who owned a firearm, this also could be a crime. And so virtually any aspect of living independently could be housed within the criminal framework. And there's another aspect of this that's important too, which is that women were not exempt from this, and neither were children. And so in my research, what I discovered and others wrote about were children as young as 9 and 10, because they stood on a corner, walked down a street, went into a park, could be charged with a crime. And if their parents could not pay the fees, and these were not mild fees of a nickel or a dime, these were fees of $50, $100, $150 in 1865, 1866, which then meant that really, I mean, these were fines and fees that white people couldn't pay other than very wealthy white people. So certainly people who had just left slavery could not afford these fines and fees, and therefore would be convicted and then leased out.
So can you talk about the impact that the punishment clause has had over time and how it's evolved and how it's been used?
Yes, and so, you know, the clause, let me share another point too that I think will also resonate with our audience. There's one additional aspect that ensnared children, and that is apprenticeship laws, which had been revered, or practices that had been revered in the Northeast, particularly with individuals who were coming from communities where their parents may not have immigrated with them. They might have come from Ireland, might have come from England, etc. These apprenticeship programs taught skills like how to become a blacksmith, how to become a carpenter, and so forth. Well, in the South, they recrafted this. And so these new apprenticeship laws post the 13th Amendment provided that if there was a white person who thought that this child was somehow being neglected, that white person could appeal to a local magistrate to become the person who would supervise this new apprentice. But of course, this was nothing about an apprenticeship program. This, in fact, was about kidnapping, quite literally, these children from their parents and then forcing them into a decade or 2 decades of bondage. And the records are really so infuriating and sad. You read these records these letters that were sent to the Freedmen's Bureau, where there were Black parents that were writing in the best language they could, because these had been people who had been denied education, but begging for the federal government to intervene so that they could get their children back. So it was really, really sad aspect of our history. But these systems then, they morphed over time, and they continued after slavery and then during Jim Crow. You read records where there were Black women who were forced to put on the, jail uniforms of Black men who were leased out on chain gangs. Many of you might remember the Song of Sam Cooke, about serving on the chain gang. I don't think that he ever did, but he's, singing about, the chain gang. But these were realities. Others were the coal mines. So if you think today about coal mines and how dangerous they happen to be today, well, there's a reason for that. Because as the coal mines were growing, they could get so many of these Black people who were so easy to be convicted, right? I mean, there was so much. This system was so thick in its profiteering that plantations actually grew in size after the abolition of slavery. There are documents that show the plantations in Georgia, Louisiana, and other states were actually bigger by percentage of land after slavery than before. But it wasn't just on plantations, but also in the coal mines. And so these coal mining magnates could lease thousands of these 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, so forth, and then just put them down in the coal mines. And when the coal mines would collapse, there would be a newspaper report about it, 50 killed, 100 killed, 170 killed, but it was no big deal because there's another lot to just bring right in. And this was a system that was so profitable, but that could lead and did lead to such corruption that you had in southern slave states where there had been people who supported slavery, but still thought that this was really a system being abused. There were actually investigations of wardens in Alabama because the wardens were making so much money on the side by just finding these, Black people and making sure they were convicted.
So this system of arresting and convicting Black people and then putting them to work and making money on it has now morphed into what we have today. That's why I understand we have mass incarceration, and it's making a lot of people a lot of money because these people are forced to work. So we have this mass incarceration. And can you talk about that, how that mass incarceration has sort of become a substitute for slavery?
Yes, I'm happy to. And in fact, we've got a couple slides for our audience, so maybe this might also be a good time too to share the screen with a couple slides if folks don't mind. So if we advance to the next slide, here's an image of Molly Williams. Can we advance to Molly's slide? Let's see. Yep, there we are. So Molly Williams is actually the first woman firefighter. And you might say that the first woman firefighter, what might come to mind is a woman in the 1970s or the 1980s. But the first woman firefighter was actually an enslaved Black woman named Molly Williams. And if you spend a moment looking at this, look at how heavy that machinery is that she's having to tug. And you notice that even though these are inclement conditions, she just has a scarf over her head. There's no special clothing that she has. You see men fleeing in their top hats and their coats. I think it's a powerful image in my mind. It says so much about what these institutions represented. The person who enslaved her said, well, she's a volunteer. I'm sure she didn't think of herself as a volunteer. But if we go to the next slide, we can get right into the thick of what Karen has asked us to think about. And that includes looking at the data regarding the U.S. mass incarceration system. Essentially, what the South provided for us was the blueprint for mass incarceration. That blueprint was the misdemeanor system. And I think it's important, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the following, which is that if we think about people who had been enslaved, the abolitionists saw them as human beings. The abolitionists saw the children as human beings that deserved care, the treatment of dignity, the comfort of our nation. The same was true for the enslaved Black woman who was put to work laboring in picking cotton, cutting sugar cane, doing all myriad of things, and Black men too. Enormous sympathy for the enslaved person. And the fight was for our nation to understand their human dignity. But what do we think of people who are convicts and criminals? And that was one of the things that was really clever that was done by Southern legislators with the 13th Amendment. Once you make somebody a criminal or a convict, then what happens psychologically is people stop thinking of them as individuals deserving human dignity, kindness, and compassion. But these people were no different than they had been before. But what had been changed was the use of law in a coercive and prurient way to re-engage the system of slavery. And it was much more difficult to articulate on the behalf of the people who were now caught and enslaved in this new system. You didn't find abolitionists looking to take the concerns of the criminal or the convict. And little did they know, or some clearly did know, that these were the same people as they had been before. So what do these issues mean today? How have they morphed in our society, this kind of misdemeanor system? And to just be clear, Dr. Polly Murray wrote a book about the US race-based criminal laws. It's 800 pages nearly and single space with all of these Southern laws. But anyway, this image gives us a sense of how aggressive the US has been caught in this system of mass incarceration. And what you can see, Karen, is the distinction between the United States, Spain, England, Italy, France, and Germany in terms of the rate of incarceration.
Now, how many of these people are actually working? Do you have any idea? Are there any statistics about that being forced into labor?
In every state except Colorado. So Colorado 2 years ago abolished fully slavery in its state. Nebraska has it on a ballot measure, Utah has it on a ballot measure, and Vermont is putting it on a ballot measure. But it's helpful perhaps to just know what this means, because these days there are people who, again, and I think this is because of the way in which people think about criminals and convicts, right? And I say that in air quotes, right? You know, this is sort of the narrative, well, they're just criminals, they're just convicts, right? But in terms of the workers and do they have to work, and we have a final slide so that you'll see at the very end all of the companies that actually engage in this. But yes, they do. And in some states, they're paid absolutely nothing. And in other states, they're paid 2 cents an hour, 4 cents an hour, 25 cents an hour, 75 cents an hour, right? And you can find more about this in my writings. Happy to send you information on that, or you can look at the data that's collected by the Prison Policy Initiative, which has been around for decades and decades, tracking this information. Overwhelmingly, what you find is that even in the most generous systems, individuals aren't making more than 90 cents an hour across the country for doing myriad forms of work. And we'll perhaps get in the conversation about whether there should be work behind bars or not. I actually think that it's a good thing, right? People like to work and they actually want to work. But the problem here is that they are not able to earn a fair wage. It's the criminal incarceration itself that's supposed to be their punishment. No jury ever says, oh, we want you to be sentenced to 5 years in prison, and while you're at it, we want you to be making lingerie for Victoria's Secret too.
And of course, this impacts the Black population much more. I think we've got a slide on that about the incarceration rates of.
That's absolutely right. So if we were to go back to just go back one set to the orange slide here. So the US incarcerates disproportionately still, and we get this from this slavery, right? Disproportionate incarceration of Black people, and also becoming situated in which we're not questioning why that is in deeper ways. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we see and opportunities with the 13th Amendment, which is to sort of shake it up a little bit for us to understand that this is not normal, that this actually had its genesis in a system that was actually designed to surveil Black people more, to arrest Black people more, to charge them more, and to get them doing this work. But it's important to know that there are other perverse ways in which these systems affect us, which is that the United States not only disproportionately incarcerates Black people, but when we look at this globally, the United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. Put Russia, China, India, Thailand combined, and toss in Mexico too. And our rates of incarceration and total, population of women's incarceration is greater. And so that's just really important for us to know. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, and so here, what we see is more about racism in policing. And it's worth taking a moment on this slide. So the imprisonment rate, as we can see on the slide, of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times what that is for white counterparts. And yet 17 million white people reported having used an illicit drug within the last month, compared to 4 million African Americans, right? So we see the sort of disparate numbers, disparate policing, and that's really not too inconsistent with historically what we've found. We can go to the next slide too, Kunga. So here, as we fill in the marks there, right? So what we have is we get a sense of the taste of US incarceration and the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. And we get to see these figures based on race and also based on sex. And I have found it really important to pay greater attention to and to try to lift up more of our discourse about women and incarceration and the school to prison pipelines involving young girls too. Sometimes we find that there are young girls, in fact, it's not sometimes, 80% of the women in detention, be it jail or girls in juvenile detention, have suffered through domestic violence, sexual abuse, and also physical abuse. And so what's interesting, if we're talking about youth, very often law enforcement sometimes sadly figure that incarceration of the girls is a way to deal with the fact that they've had these hardships at home. And I've actually heard that from law enforcement, that, well, what else can we do with her? And certainly you think a person who's come through victimization at home, juvenile detention is perhaps not the best way. So that's a lot that I've just said, Karen.
So one of the ways that we can see this now is, and you mentioned this currently, we have our prisoners in California are out fighting wildfires. And, they could say they're volunteers, but I don't know that that's what you really call voluntary work. So can you address that problem? And also the problem that now there's so many prisoners being released because of COVID. What's the impact on our ability to fight fires in California when we're relying so much on prisoners? And then a third part of this is, like, what happens to these guys and women who learn how to fight fires when they finally get released? Is there any path for them to get a good job in a fire department?
Mm-hmm. Just one second. Okay. Work. So Shauna Lynn Jones, let me tell you a story about Shauna Lynn Jones. She died in 2016, only hours after battling a fire in Southern California. She was nearly done with a 3-year prison sentence. Only 2 months remained of her incarceration. However, the night before, she and other women were called to put out a raging fire, and she was on a crew of incarcerated firefighting women who routinely perform really arduous and dangerous work. Sometimes these women trudge very heavy chains and saws and medical supplies, safety gear, and other equipment up burning hillsides surrounding by flames. And on this particular night, the task was especially arduous and challenging, and it required the women to traverse a really steep hillside of loose rocks and soil. One of the women later recounted how Miss Jones really struggled. The weight of her gear was really heavy, and the chainsaw she carried made it really difficult for her to establish her footing, a solid footing, and actually hike up that hillside where the fires just blazed all around them. And yet she and the other women, as part of that crew, performed their duties. They held back the fire so that it didn't actually do what's called jumping the line and burn these really expensive homes in Malibu. Their efforts saved the communities that night that they were trying to protect. But by 10 a.m. the next morning, she was dead. That night before, while she was on the hill and clearing all of that wood and fire away, the earth just gave away, sending a rock down that struck her in the head and knocked her unconscious. And she never woke up from that. And unfortunately, there's really nothing that's unique about her death. We don't hear about it. It doesn't make the news. I'm happy to say, with what I've been writing about, we've had some new publications come out. There's going to be something in the LA Times this weekend about some of these issues. But for the most part, we've taken all of this as normal. We've not really sort of, digested whether this actually should be the case. I mean, maybe it should have been enough that Miss Jones was taken away from her community, from her home, from her family, that she was placed in a system of incarceration, one that would stigmatize her for the rest of her life. That by being incarcerated here in California, it would mean that by leaving the incarceral system, she might not be able to get a job, even hair braiding. The ways that we've made it very difficult so that people who have actually served their time don't necessarily get their records expunged, even if they die in the process of helping all of us out. And that's a challenge. So right now, the question of all of these fires, well, we have people who are incarcerated who fight these fires. And it's important to note that a lot of people really love their jobs and they take pride in the work that they do. They don't necessarily love the fact that there is a kind of unequal system that's worth us talking about behind bars. And let me talk a little bit more about what that means. We kind of take for granted that because our tax dollars spend so much on incarceration, that somehow these people should be grateful. But here's the thing. The money that we spend on incarceration doesn't go to these people at all. So we're paying lots of fees in our taxes and whatnot, but they're paying lots of fees too. And that's something that we don't think about. So people across the country who happen to be incarcerated, if they want to call home to their families, those phone calls can cost more than $1 or $2 per minute. To have a 5-minute phone call with a family member can cost $15 or $20, right? Fees associated with getting a toothbrush and toothpaste, that's not free for them. They have to go to the commissary. And the commissary is not like Walgreens or CVS. They pay really jacked up prices that can be 300, 400, 500 the times like the cost of what it is that we pay for our toothpaste or our toothbrush. And so there's sometimes this resentment about these people behind bars, but these people behind bars actually have to pay fees. And if you think about this, in Florida, there was a referendum so that people who were formerly incarcerated could actually vote. And then the Florida legislature went back and said, well, no, we don't want them to vote until they pay back all of their fees and fines, right? And guess what? In our carceral system, it doesn't stop just because we pay taxes. They still have fees. And now think about this. We're making them work for free or for very little. What a terrible system that is, at least I think, right? Well, they could be working and making a minimum wage. And by doing so, and this gets to your third question, Karen, imagine if we had a system where, in fact, there was at least a minimum wage that people earned while they were behind bars, so that they could actually build up some reserve for when they leave, that they're able to pay their fees and their fines. But then when they leave their system of incarceration, they have something to begin with, because we've made it very punitive. If you've been incarcerated, the government doesn't help in terms of providing any subsidy with your housing, no subsidy with regard to an education. In fact, there are laws that ban the government from being able to support or help you if you've been a convicted felon with an education, and so much more. So it's a system that actually doesn't help very much because it leads to great recidivism. and cost for us.
Now, there's a lot of companies that take advantage of this, and I know you kind of have a ball of shame.
Yes.
The companies that, I mean, we all get upset because in foreign countries there's slave and child labor, and we try to avoid those companies. But what we don't know is this is going on in our country, and there's a lot of companies who are using this prison labor, essentially paying them nothing, and then selling us their goods without telling us how they got paid. So if you want to,
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And to see the brilliance of you, Karen, because you brought that up, because that's a very important point. So again, we're sort of distanced from our involvement in this. So the kinds of companies that we're talking about, Whole Foods, Walmart, McDonald's, Cargill, Victoria's Secret they got out of this, they were shamed out of this. AT&T, Bank of America, Bayer, Eli Lilly and Company, Exxon Mobil, Johnson & Johnson, what's being used in your shampoo or your kids' shampoo or your grandkids' shampoo, Kmart, the Koch Brother Industries, Motorola, Shell, Starbucks. When's the last time you had a good Starbucks coffee? UPS, Verizon, Wendy's, that Wendy's hamburger, Honeywell, Hewlett Packard, Nordstrom's, Macy's, Revlon, Target, right? And so when you think about it, I mean, that's a lot of these companies that are involved in all of this. Now, some of them may think, well, they're doing something good. They're providing a resource, but this gets back to your third question again, Karen, which was so important, which is that, yeah, that might be good, but many of these companies will not hire these people when they get out because they do a ban the box. Have you been incarcerated before? If you've been incarcerated, no job interview for you. No advancing beyond go. And so these very people have been put to work where companies say, well, this is good. I'm providing a good service, even though you're not being paid anything for making our underwear or helping to do whatever, making the glasses. Eyeglasses are done by a lot of folks in prison, couches and things like that. But when these folks get out, there are a number of practices and also laws that bar them the opportunity to become gainfully employed in the very areas where they worked in.
okay, I have one last question on maybe a more hopeful note. And that is whether you have any concrete suggestions as what we might do personally or as a society to end this system.
Well, I think that this is an issue that really should come up on our ballot initiative referendum, because, or the legislature just go directly to engage this as well. I think we should be concerned about any vestiges of slavery, material or symbolic, that rests in our federal constitution and our state constitutions. It is really time to abolish slavery full and wholesale. And then beyond that, to look at the indignities that are found in this kind of system, right? The system that leads to people sometimes dying, putting out fires, and certainly the indignities of working with no wages whatsoever or coercively low wages that really do not allow people to be able to purchase the items that they actually need. Often they have to, communicate with families at home who then send them, resources so that they can buy things like soap and toothpaste and toothbrushes and things like that. So I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation, and I think we need to lift up these issues because many people don't know about them, and that's why I wanted to talk with you all about it.
Well, thank you, Michele. Do we have any questions? Does anyone see the Q&A box? Okay, Karen Everts. So Karen says, as a very young high school teacher downtown LA long ago in the 60s, I was appalled at how many of my Black kids had never learned to read up to par. So would not graduate, might fall into petty crime and thus incarceration. What can be done?
So that's, what a wonderful question. I too am deeply concerned about our system of education. And if you look at our system of education, it also has its roots in slavery. So recently I wrote an article for the Michigan Law Review about our antebellum period and the kinds of laws that existed at the time. And there was such a fierce devotion to keeping Black people enslaved that it was against the law for them to learn how to read and to learn how to write. And it was criminally punishable if a white person was caught teaching a Black person how to read or how to write. Now we could say that, well, look, that's all over, Brown v. Board of Education into that, but it's really important for us to understand how these systems gain life within the broader framework of our democracy. And that's in part why it's been so hard to crack this nut. We actually don't have a system that provides for equal education. It's not in our federal constitution. Many states have enacted laws that provide now for there being education as a right, but it was not perceived as so in our constitution. And we don't act as if it is a right. And so, I mean, so it's an issue that we've seen come up in a number of ways, and you've seen it as a teacher, just what happens when we have unequal pathways to an education. And I can tell you, having worked in Kentucky for 5 years to help implement Brown v. Board of Education in the early 90s, which shows you how far behind they were since the case was from 1954, another population that's often overlooked are poor white people. I had enormous sympathy for the white families that would appear before the school board in which I worked, because those families were so deeply shut out too. And the look of misery and poverty on their faces still lingers with me. And so I think what we need to focus on is an education system that has standards for everybody. I don't know why we're not committed to a system that provides the best of resources for every teacher and for every child. Why is that so difficult for us? I don't think that education policies and funding should be tied to tax dollars and communities. That makes absolutely no sense. We know that there will always be some communities that are better off than others, but children should not have to suffer because of the economies they were born into.
Okay, let's see. Here's another question. Oh, so Dorothy Larson has asked whether there isn't something in the works, I guess in California, that would allow these prisoners to continue to work as firefighters when they get out.
That would be absolutely wonderful. There are some efforts now, such as very recently, a law that was enacted here in California that would provide for the expungement of records, but no pathway or guarantee towards future employment as firefighters. But, you know, considering the climate, how climate change is affecting us, global warming is affecting us, what we know in California is that we will have future fires. We wish that we would not, but we know that we will. Having individuals who are trained, who are committed, who find that they like doing this work is something that we should want, and we should provide pathways to it. Only we have not done that at all, and we're missing an opportunity in this regard. We should actually engage in pathways that make it much easier for people who are formerly incarcerated and firefighters in their period of incarceration to be able post-incarceration to enter into the system, which is state government system. This should actually not be that difficult for us. We can't force, we can try to encourage private industries to do certain things, but this is actually state. We should be able to find the ways to make it easier for people who were incarcerated to be able to fight fires.
So I have maybe this is our last question. Wait a minute, somebody else has asked a question, but I guess my question is, there any group that has been formed that's protesting these companies that are using prison labor and trying to make it known to people that this is going on?
No. So what's amazing about this is that most law professors don't know about the full reading of the 13th Amendment. Becoming more attuned in the wake of what we see in terms of criminal justice, the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and whatnot, and that's causing at law school for there to be deeper introspection about race and law. But it's very easy to say, oh, 13th Amendment, that abolished slavery, and forget everything else. So this was really a new awakening. right? And so in this new awakening, I think that we will find there to be more organizations that are pushing forward information to inform the public about the companies that engage in this, and to also work with those companies to try to do a better job and make commitments, right? So one thing, for example, wouldn't it be great if some of these companies say, okay, what we're going to do is pledge that if you worked for us behind bars and you did so really well with great recommendations, we've got a job for you when you leave, right? What a great thing.
Well, and then I guess there's a whole lot of other people in prison who don't have jobs. I mean, I've heard that a lot of the prisoners are having to do what the prison guards would normally do, serving food and cleaning and the really dangerous things that expose them to COVID.
Yes, you did
Because
ask about
the
COVID.
prison guards don't want to do it anymore. And I'm thinking, and I don't know if there's any statistics on how many of those people have become ill or how many have died, but I expect that there is a problem.
Our jails and our prisons have become hotspots. We did at the ACLU do research on this, and there was an effort to make sure that jails and prisons release individuals who are not thought to be a danger to society, such as to minimize the risk of COVID. I mean, COVID hotspots, for rather obvious reasons, it's very difficult to socially distance, and one's movements are prohibited generally, so it's not easy to actually remove oneself from crowded situations and whatnot. And so we have seen actually outbreaks in jails, right, in Chicago and in other places. And as to the labor, who's doing what, it's interesting because some people will say, well, isn't this just great? You were able to be a firefighter behind bars, and to do that, and that gives you a greater advantage than somebody else. As I've said, there is no easy pathway or pathway at all for people who fought fires in jail to actually get that work afterwards. But there is a lot of work being done, right? So not all of it may be sexy firefighting, right? Or dangerous firefighting. Some of it is stitching couches. Some of it is making lenses for glasses and contacts and sewing clothes and things like that. Things that we would otherwise say that's sweatshop stuff if it were in India, if it were in Thailand, but we pay no attention to it in the United States because people don't know about it.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I think, I certainly think very differently about the 13th Amendment now. I mean, I remember the Steven Spielberg movie, Lincoln, that came out a few years ago that made the 13th Amendment sound like it was the best thing since sliced bread. And it never really talked about the downside. So I really appreciate you bringing this to our attention, and maybe we'll form a group. Go after those companies that are using prison labor.
There you go. I mean, it certainly is an equality platform for people who are paying greater attention to the concerns of women, particularly in the wake of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. Let's keep in mind that 2/3 of the women who are incarcerated are nonviolent offenders. They are moms, and they're disenfranchised when they leave. They literally have not much to rely on when they get out. And they're even barred from doing things like becoming barbers and hairdressers, because you're barred if you've been incarcerated from receiving a license in certain professions. So let's do something about this.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle, and the rest of you guys. I will see you maybe next week. We'll see what Trump does. If he stands firm that he's not going to have a distance debate, then we'll see you next week. Otherwise, we'll let you know what the revised schedule is. So thanks for coming.